So now Sean will be setting it up for our speaker. Andrea Delligatti has received her doctorate in counsel psychology in 1982. And she's been in Chester County for since 1984. And through her private practice provides psychological, coaching, and meditation services to individuals, families, and businesses. So we're really pleased to have her here today. She has authored 8 professional publications and presented over 25 professional workshops. At the last count, she has coached over 800 individuals, clients, and consulted with 20 plus business organizations. So we're pleased to have Andrea join us now to talk about connections that count during this time where connections are becoming very crucial to us.
And Andrea, if you wouldn't mind going off, it appears you're on mute right now. And then feel free to share your screen if you like, and I could stop.
There she is.
There I am. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Although I do wish it was in person. I absolutely love working with people, but this last few months of doing it remotely, let's just say there's been lots of new learning of electronic gadgetry, and I'm no spring chicken. So hopefully this new webcam setup works for all of us, and on we go. And I'm going to practice some of that meditation and mindfulness stuff right here now to kind of keep us in line. But you should know, 40 years ago, I was in graduate school and I learned an awful lot about how people grow and learn and develop over the course of time. But that was up to, quote, retirement age. And back then, nothing was written about our senior years. So what's a person like me, and maybe like you, to do? I'm already older than the retirement ages of my parents. My kids think that I need help doing things that I'm perfectly capable of doing on my own. And then in March, right, we all remember that March, we had that CDC announcement about, quote, older people being more at risk for COVID. I asked my husband, so who are these older people? And I asked him, I said, will you go to that website of CDC and see who that is? I'm not kidding. I really did ask him to go to check it out. And he said, well, the magic age is 65. We looked at each other and we started laughing and we said, oh my gosh, we're now the older people. So like, how does that happen? Hopefully today, in the time we have together, I could provide for you some news, hopefully, that's more uplifting news than what the media focus has been for the last 3 months. So I want to jump right in with some of that, and hopefully I'm not going to bore you with too many details. But I do want to give you a flavor for leading up to why it's important to have connections. So good news first. Decades of scientific research provides clear evidence that aging is not as predetermined as previously thought. Pretty good news, right? It's not predetermined. The bad news is most of us still hold a negative view of growing older. That definitely stands in the way of our optimizing our chances for a healthy and productive second half of our life, if you stop and think about it. So if you're one of those people who tend to have the glass half empty, hopefully I can change your thinking just a little bit so that we older people here can learn how to live the fullest lives that we can. Now, the caveat, of course, is that we're a very heterogeneous group of people. There's lots of variety of individuals in the age category if we talk about over 50. The information I'm going to present today applies generally to this group of people in aging. We're going to recognize that there's individual variables that could affect people that may confound some of this data, but for the most part, the evidence stands for the greatest number of us. So hopefully that'll be okay with you if I can present in that way. All right, so I'd like to start by just trying to debunk 3 common misconceptions about aging. First is that aging involves loss and decline, that aging is beyond our control, and that aging is irreversible. I know I already have some of you getting ready to tune out because I just said things that, what are you talking about, Andrea? This couldn't possibly be. All right, let's start with number one. Aging is not all about loss and decline. Research shows that primary mental abilities in adults do not even begin to decline until after the age of 80. Everybody got that? Mental decline does not happen until after 80. Two, there are significant improvements in certain personality traits. Believe it or not, the older we get to be a little more agreeable, a little more conscientious, more emotionally stable. If we love to be around people, that stays intact. And if our openness to new experience also stays intact. So we have improvements in some personality traits. Also, as we age, we experience higher levels of emotional well-being, life satisfaction, and more positive than negative emotions compared to younger adults. Did you hear what I just said? Higher levels of emotional well-being, life satisfaction, and more positive than negative emotions compared to younger adults. So we may be getting older, but definitely we're getting better in many ways. All right, that's myth number one, debunked hopefully for you. Myth number two has to do with our control over our aging process. We have more control than we give ourselves credit for. Research shows that that lifestyle factors, and when lifestyle factors, diet, exercise, sleep hygiene, social connections, they account for more variance in health and psychological outcomes than do our genetics. The way we live account more than our genetics. And I don't know if you've heard the term plasticity. You'll probably hear more and more about it. Plasticity involves the person's capacity to develop new forms of behavior and performance to alter physiological processes. And the best way I can think of to demonstrate plasticity is if you've known anyone who has had a brain trauma, a car accident, a stroke, a head injury of some sort, and you know that they lose some of their physiological, some of their processes, and they go back into a variety of therapies, occupational therapy, speech therapy, cognitive therapy, lots of different therapies take place. Those people, if you know, I mean, they may have injured a portion of their brain, and we're not going to make that part of the brain better. But what we can do is we can do these therapies that create new pathways in the brain so that behaviors can, again, be reinitiated. You can learn new parts. So even as the older we get, we still have that plasticity, and that brain, believe it or not, is still ready to take over some of the functions by developing new pathways. So lifestyle factors are important. You all hear it, get up and get moving. Regular physical activity. We know that moving around impacts your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system. We all know that if we want to look in shape, our musculoskeletal system, it would be good for us to move. But did you know that regular physical activity can also increase your resistance to type 2 diabetes as well as cancer? That's just the beginning. On top of that, we have mood improvements as well as improvements in cognitive functioning, all for getting up and moving around. I know we haven't been able to move very much in our houses these last few months, but the importance of it cannot be underestimated. And by the way, the trail, when nobody's on it, if you go walking, it's one of the few places you can go without a mask, I think. I have found that very helpful during the last few months. So regular physical activity is important. Engaging in cognitively demanding or novel activities. What does that mean? Things that make you think a little bit, exercise that brain, something new, something different. It actually enhances our memory and our cognitive abilities. So say yes to the AARP games that are online. Continue to do them. This research in this area then indicates that we do have some control over this aging process. The ball's in our court as to what we do with this in terms of our lifestyle factors, our physical activities as well as cognitive activities. The third myth is that age-related loss can never be reversed, and that certainly is not true. And if you stop and think about this again, back to the whole cognitive functioning, and cognitive is how you think, how you problem solve. If you do activities that stimulate your thinking and your problem solving, there is evidence from research that age-related decline can sometimes be reversed and at the very least be held steady. So not just the games online, but also social activities, planning get-togethers, being creative in some way, that engages and stimulates your brain. Another thing that many of us this may resonate with, loss of mass or bone density. How many of us out there have a diagnosis of osteoporosis? We know that osteoporosis is age-related. We know it's progressive. And if you're inactive, you're not eating properly, and you have other maybe physiological changes, we can increase our risk for falls and fractures that limit our mobility. Not good. It keeps us stuck. But what do we do now? Something like appropriate levels of vitamin D, meaning that we're eating the right foods, can be help to reverse osteoporosis. We also know that resistance and strength training can also help to reverse the processes. So myth number 3 is that it's not all irreversible. So the 3 myths, that it's all decline and loss, not so much, that it's irreversible, not true, and third, that we have control over this more than we give ourselves credit for. So research debunks those myths. And why in the world am I spending this time telling you this? Because we need to change the narrative on aging. That's the only way we're going to optimize the second half of our lives, to be able to live fully and happily without stigma. Because I don't know about you, but there's a lot of stigma associated with getting older. And we're going to be the only ones to help to change that message out there, which is part of the reason I'm doing this, this kind of presentation. As we age, just as with any other phase of life, there are changes, there are setbacks, and we need to deal with them. It's not all a downhill slide. There's plenty more we can learn to do and to help ourselves. And I just saw I'm trying to remember where I saw it, about the 100 centenarians, over 100, and one of the ladies, she started running at 95. Running at 95. I don't run at this age, but she started running at 95. Maybe when I get to 95, I'll run. But anyway, these are the kind of things we can still change. There are things that we can do. But what did I tell you? I told you that most of us have a negative view of aging, right? And what happens if we have a negative view of aging? If we buy into the doom and gloom, what do we humans do? I know you know. We start to focus on the negative. Our thinking becomes negative. Our moods become negative. And if we're thinking in a negative way and our moods are more negative, angry, depressed, what do? We isolate ourselves. And what happens when we isolate ourselves? We become lonely. Be honest, last 3 months that we've been out here on our own, it's been pretty lonely. We are social beings. We do not do well when we're cut off from social contact. So if most of us have a negative view of aging, then does that mean that many of us are lonely? Something to think about. So now I need to talk about the research on loneliness. And to be honest, this research has only come about in the last 15 years or so. So in scientific circles, this is hot off the press for the last 15 years. So loneliness is a universal human experience, although the word may mean different things to different people. Loneliness as a human experience has very real consequences on our mental and our physical health. And believe it or not, the researchers who have been measuring loneliness, they actually came up with a scale. So if you, in case you wondered and you want to go check it out, there is a UCLA loneliness scale. It's like a 20-item questionnaire, and it asks all about the feelings surrounding loneliness, but never asks people directly about loneliness. So it's a good research tool, and us, psychologists, geeks that like research, we get excited about that. When you can measure something and people don't really know what you're measuring, it's kind of a cool thing. But I wanted to so that you don't just think I'm talking about something in a vague way, I wanted to kind of quantify or put a number on the impact of loneliness in our world here today. There was a study done by researchers at AARP Public Policy Institute in association with, I think it was Stanford and Harvard. And the impact of people living in social isolation adds almost $7 billion a year to the cost of Medicare. You heard me right. People living in isolation adds almost $7 billion per year to the cost of Medicare, mostly attributable to longer hospital stays. But why is that? It's because most people don't have community supports at home, in their community, in their places where they're going home to. So they stay longer. Pretty big number. I don't know. Medicare's a good thing. Don't want it to go broke. So what can we do about that $7 billion a year? I think it's upon all of us to try to, pull together and help here. I want to tell you about the research of Professor Julianne Holt-Lunstad, I think she says her name. She's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University. And she was thinking about this loneliness thing. And she said, is it loneliness specifically, or is it people becoming more socially disconnected from each other in a variety of ways? So I already told you we can measure loneliness on the scale. And many people say, well, that feeling of loneliness is subjective. But we can look at other more quantifiable factors bearing on loneliness. And, we just had to do the census, right? We have census data on how many people are living alone. We also know about the declining marriage rates. Increasing childlessness means we don't have big families around us anymore. And because we're all connected electronically, and if you didn't realize that before these last 3 months, we could actually look at how much time you're spent watching TV. How much time are you on the internet? And guess what? They love to use cell phone data. We all walk around with these cell phones in our pocket, but they're collecting data on us and where we're going, and if we're going anywhere, or is that cell phone staying in one spot? So loneliness can be tracked in a number of different ways by accessing some of this data as well. So Dr. Lunstad, she co-authored a landmark study, and they looked at 3 groups of people that might be seen as lacking sufficient social connections. So what are the 3 groups of people? People who are truly socially isolated from others. They go nowhere, they don't connect. They're socially isolated. That's group 1. Group 2 was a group that described themselves as very lonely. They subjectively felt very lonely. And the 3rd group were those who lived alone. And by the way, right, we can live alone and not necessarily feel lonely. And we could live in the midst of a bunch of people and still feel very lonely. So these are the 3 groups. From others, describing themselves as very lonely, or those who live alone. The researchers pooled data collected from 70 different studies that followed 3.4 million people on an average of 7 years. That's a lot of data. 70 studies, 3.4 million participants for an average of 7 years, and they came to one startling conclusion. that each of these groups faced roughly the same risk of an early death. Each of the groups, it didn't matter if you were socially isolated, feeling lonely, living alone. That risk was 30%. It hovered right around 30% for each group. It was like, I think the socially isolated was 29%, the very lonely was 26%, and get this, those who, quote, just lived alone, 32%. So if you fall in any one of those groups, we have an increased risk of early death. And oh, by the way, it didn't matter if the participants were healthy at the time of this study. So we all know, right, if we feel ill, if we have a physical condition, a psychological condition, mental health issues, that can put you at risk for loneliness and isolation. But the evidence said it didn't matter if people were healthy or not. So whether or not you're healthy, those who are more socially connected actually live longer. Those who are more socially connected live longer. Pretty powerful stuff, I'd say. All right, so just in case you don't start thinking of me as just talking about this feeling of loneliness, this touchy-feely stuff, I want to tell you about another study that was originally published in 2007 by a Dr. Steve Cole. He was a professor of medicine, psychiatry, and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA School of Medicine. And he was a genome researcher, a geneticist. And he was looking at blood samples under a microscope from lonely people. Remember that UCLA, they had that loneliness scale, they found it. So he was looking at blood samples from lonely people, and he just couldn't believe his eyes. He found their white blood cells appeared to be in a high state of alert, responding in a way as they would if they were responding to a bacterial infection. But there was no infection in these bodies of these people. It was a blood sample of just, quote, lonely people. So what he found was this inflammation at a cellular level from something that we think about as just an emotion. And all of a sudden, I mean, he walked away saying, oh my gosh, it looks like loneliness is some sort of a disease that the body is fighting off. And you know, when we get a cut, a wound on our hands or whatever, we know that the white blood cells rush in and fight off infection from the wound. Now just imagine, we've got this going on inside of our bodies. Our blood, our white blood cells are reacting this way, and there is no infection. So it's kind of like fighting against something, it's an invisible disease, if you will, invisible. It actually changed this guy's whole focus, I think, to broaden his perspective in terms of his research. And so what they basically come down to is that loneliness is the nexus where molecular biology and psychology kind of intersect. And what they started to notice is that there's this kind of intricate dance that's created between the mind and the body, taking cues from each other. Does that make sense? You hear mind-body connection, right? You hear that a lot, but there's a great example of blood cells reacting in a way to something we thought was just an emotion, and then those cells are going to feed that information to the brain cells. All right, so let's go back. So we have a lonely person. The cells in our body are in a constant state of alert of the lonely person. They're chronically inflamed, like something's wrong. The blood cells feed that information to the brain cells. The brain cells then, right, if the brain is hearing that we're sick, feeling that we're sick, the person is feeling something's not right. They might not be able to put their finger on it. They just, you know how when you feel sick sometimes, something just isn't right. And maybe they feel like they're under attack in some way, just like those cells are being under attack. And what happens when we don't feel well and we're sick? We might not exactly be the most pleasant people to be around. Maybe we start to misread social signals You know, somebody comes and says something nice and we might want to bite their head off. Maybe, I mean, just saying. What the research shows is that the lonely person outwardly, they're responding with irritability, maybe a little suspiciousness. Maybe they pretend like they're not pretend. They feel like there's no interest, disinterest, negative emotion, whether that's depression, sadness, anger, anxiety. When you're not feeling well, other people can be a pain in the neck, right? They could even be a threat. So if I'm feeling like other people are kind of, I can't trust them, I'm not going to jump right out to meet them. So I'm going to be afraid of meeting them. I'm certainly not going to make new friends with them. So what am I doing to those other people? A lonely person pushes other people away because of this, because again, the brain is reacting to what's going on in the body, and it's putting out signals to everybody else to stay away from me. And so now we have more loneliness. So then we have this vicious cycle. The body's inflamed, the person's lonely, which keeps the body inflamed, which keeps us even more lonely, and we keep going round and round in circles. Now, I don't know if any of you have actually experienced this, seen this in someone you know, someone close to you. I know I observed it in my mother-in-law, who, by the way, lived independently until 98 and a half, at which point she kept falling and she had macular degeneration. So we had some assisted living going on, and she was always made new friends. She was very social. She, no matter where she went, she made friends. But when we had to then kind of move her after 6 months because of her balance issues and because of her eyesight into some nursing care, something started to change. And it didn't matter how often we visited, and it didn't matter how many antidepressants, because you know we're always going to put people on medicine, antidepressants or anti-anxiety agents or stuff like that. I kept watching her push people away from her over and over again, and that was not her personality. And actually, when I saw this research study, I was like, wow, this captures it. No matter, because she then, oh, by the way, she was always loved to be of service to other people. So all of a sudden, she couldn't do that anymore. And that was the role she had in many of her social engagements. And that was kind of taken away because she couldn't do for others, they were doing for her. And I think she lost something there. And I think what we saw is the outwardness of the loneliness. And try as we might, it was so difficult to get those connections. And I always wonder if I had moved her into a community earlier, not that I could say she would agree to doing it, but if she had that community around her, would that have felt differently for her as some of the other functions failed? But anyway, I do believe that this loneliness explains behaviors of some older folks, and I also think it contributes to some of the unflattering characterizations of older people that we have presented in our society. So, all right, I just ran through very quickly research spanning the fields of molecular biology, psychology, neuroscience, genetics, sociology, and they all point to one reality. As we age, there's a complex set of factors that influence the process, right? We have ourselves, our body, the organs and tissues and cells that make up our body, but then we have that, what we call the person, who's the sum total of our behaviors, our habits, our attitudes, our decisions, cognitions, emotions, us, what we consider us. So we have our body, we have the person, and then we have the context, which is our physical and social environment, you know, our laws, our culture around us. So body, person, and context, and it's a complex set of factors that all come together to influence our aging process. So what's the ultimate good news of all of this, if you can take anything away? Social connections keep us healthy because they stave off loneliness. So social connections keep us healthy because they stave off loneliness. So, suggestions to maintain social connections, but I also want to capitalize on that other research that said proper nutrition, physical activity, cognitive stimulation help us to do these and keep these social connections. And I have to tell you, with this lockdown or stay-at-home order or whatever the heck we're going to call this thing that we've been in for the last 3 months, the most creative ideas I've heard for social connection have come from my older clients. So I want to share some of them with you because I think these are just amazing. My one client started telling me about drinks on the driveway. And I was like, drinks on the driveway? And she goes, well, you know, we're not allowed to get close to anybody. And so at 5 o'clock, she lives in a townhouse kind of development. She said, so at 5 o'clock, we all go out. And she says, whether it's a cocktail or a glass of wine or just, you know, a soda, a drink of some sort, we just all go on our driveways and we can try to talk to each other and stay socially distanced. Love that idea. Another one, another person was part of a group at her church where they made, I guess you would call them lap blankets. Some people call them prayer shawls. And I know they go out, sometimes they go to the nursing homes, they go out to hospice, they go out to some hospitals, and they would be doing this circle of ladies crocheting at someone's home. And they couldn't do that anymore. So we did knitting and crocheting on the porch in a socially distanced way. They could still talk to each other. Another person loved to do this, was it Mahjong? I've never played it, but evidently that used to be at 11 o'clock and it was at one of the Ys, and then the Ys closed down and we weren't allowed to do it. So they turned that into the lunchtime social hour where they all went with their chairs themselves and sat in the parking lot of the Y and had lunch together and just chatted with each other. My other client, 84, who was, of course, the family doesn't want anybody to go to the store and get groceries or anything, and they're all being very protective. And so most of my older clients have said, yeah, I have to be careful how much I actually tell my kids. And of course, I am saying, but you have to be safe. And then they tell me what they're doing. So this one was the meeting in the park. To 85-year-olds, and they would go drive separately to meet at a local park, and they would sit on opposite sides of the picnic table at opposite ends of the table and have lunch once a week with each other and chat. Now this one, for those who like a little more activity, there was the weekly virtual dance party with grandchildren. This is every week it happened, and the grandchildren, they were anywhere from like 10 preteen to teens, and the two sets of grandparents, everybody every week somebody else got to choose the music and what kind of dance would be done, and I forget which one had the Alexa that was blaring the music, and yes, they were virtually dancing. I believe that was through Zoom. It was some kind of video thing that they were using for that one. And then another client, he and his siblings have the daily riddle and joke contest. And that was always via text with each other. So every day they were checking in with each other. I don't know. Those were pretty creative ideas that I wanted to share with you because they just stuck with me and I think it's great. And then there's a lot of things that we can do in person. We can also do virtually, hopefully for not too much longer. And think of the things that you could do out there, whether it's diet, nutrition, working out, whatever it is, but just add people to it. So that's the social connection. And I don't know, I'm pretty much an introvert, so I don't like big groups of people. And I find that if I have a task or I have something that I'm doing with other people, it gives me a way of connecting more easily. And oh, by the way, it builds those social connections. That's something extra for me. But what other things? You know, if you want to go for a walk or do a workout with someone, do it with a friend or a neighbor. I do have another client who, after the beginning of the year, started a new diet, because that's what everybody does, right? At the beginning of the year. And she had a friend that was supposed to be doing it with her, and then that friend dropped out. And so then she convinced her parents to do it with her. And all of a sudden they were sharing recipes. They were on video cooking with each other and everything. And even her father, who was, I guess her dad was in his late 70s, never cooked a day in his life. All of a sudden was excited to try out recipes. She started with salads with him, but was building up with cooking. Even a book club or a discussion group if you have a special interest. I loved while we were in this stay at home, all the virtual tours that were done for live, the different museums and galleries and the musical concerts. You can always get other people to join in with you and do those things together. I had one young man who went on a virtual date. Young man, I said, right? A virtual date. And I said, so what did that look like? And he said, we both, I forget what the movie was, they had it on Netflix, and they watched the movie together virtually. They were connected. I guess it was FaceTime as they were watching the movie and sharing and talking and chuckling about it. Great idea. Also, remember, we were supposed to be doing things challenging ourselves cognitively. And, we talked about the AARP games. It's all good, but just remember, switch up the games. So make them new and different. But, taking a class, any kind of class, learn something new. The young kids are all into online video competitions. There's no reason why we can't do that as well. I do have one client who connected with someone in the British Isles somewhere over there. And that's been very helpful to her because they spend less time playing the game and more time now connecting and talking to each other and learning things about each other. I love community gardening. I don't know. I think there's lots of those kind of places around. Raised beds are good for community gardening. So we're not totally in the dirt all the time, and getting up and down is a little easier with the raised beds. Joining a church or a church activity group, I think, is great. Volunteering. Even just planning an event with someone else, doing something like that. All of those things are stimulating in a variety of different ways, but also offering that social connection piece that seems to be vital for our continued enjoyment of our lives and continuing to be able to move around and enjoy as fully as we can. So, all right, I just threw lots of information at everyone. So I will, I guess, open it up if there's any questions or concerns.